Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. The biggest story is not a single battlefield movement. It is the growing pressure on the entire Russian war system as Moscow enters the NATO summit in Ankara, trying to project confidence while dealing with mounting questions about military sustainability, economic strain, and the vulnerability of its own rear areas. President Trump is heading into meetings with NATO allies after speaking with both Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. And Russia is working hard to shape the diplomatic environment around those conversations. Moscow continues pushing the message that it is willing to negotiate while portraying Ukraine as the obstacle to peace. Russian officials have emphasized continued engagement with Washington, while Ukrainian officials are trying to convince Trump and European leaders that Russia's recent actions demonstrate the opposite. That pressure, not concessions, is what brought Moscow closer to the negotiating table. The timing of Russian military activity matters. The Kremlin has repeatedly used moments of major diplomacy to send political messages, and the latest attacks on Ukraine appear designed with that same goal in mind. The message from Moscow is essentially that Russia still controls escalation and that supporting Ukraine will come with costs. But the picture inside Russia is more complicated. Ukraine is increasingly demonstrating an ability to reach targets far beyond the traditional battlefield, and that is creating strategic problems for the Kremlin. The most notable example came this week when Ukrainian drones struck the Omsk oil refinery in Siberia, one of Russia's largest energy facilities, and located thousands of kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory. The significance of that strike is not just the damage at one refinery. It is the psychological and strategic impact. Russia has always relied heavily on geographic depth as a shield. The Soviet Union built its security model around the idea that distance mattered. Ukraine is now challenging that assumption by showing that even deep inside Russia, critical infrastructure can be vulnerable. The energy sector has become a major pressure point. Ukrainian strikes against Russian refineries, ports, and fuel infrastructure are contributing to shortages and disruptions across parts of the country. Russian officials are trying to manage public concern, but those efforts are becoming increasingly difficult. In one striking example, Vologda Governor Georgy Filimonov warned residents against panic buying fuel, then later admitted his own vehicle ran out of gasoline and he needed a ride from traffic police. Those moments may seem small, but they matter in a tightly controlled information environment. The Kremlin has spent years projecting an image of stability and competence. Stories like that create a very different picture for ordinary Russians. Moscow is responding with more state control. Russian authorities continue expanding efforts to bring strategically important companies under government ownership. A recent example involved Transbunker, a major marine fuel supplier, where courts ordered company assets transferred to the state. Since the beginning of the war, Russia has increasingly used national security justifications to absorb private businesses into state hands, accelerating a trend that gives the Kremlin greater control over the economy. At the same time, Russia continues tightening internal security. The Federal Security Service, or FSB, maintains extensive surveillance capabilities through the SORM system, which allows authorities access to large amounts of telecommunications and internet data. The government continues highlighting alleged sabotage and espionage cases, reinforcing the Kremlin narrative that Russia is fighting not only Ukraine, but a broader foreign intelligence campaign. That internal security focus also reflects a larger concern: controlling the domestic narrative as the costs of the war become harder to hide. Now, turning back to Ukraine, the immediate military issue remains air defense, but the broader story is industrial capacity. Russia's recent strikes against Kyiv showed a familiar pattern. Moscow can still launch large attacks, but Ukraine's ability to respond depends heavily on access to advanced interceptors. Ukraine has become extremely efficient at managing limited resources. Patriot crews have adapted by conserving expensive interceptors for the threats only those systems can stop, while using cheaper methods against drones. They have changed tactics, moved systems quickly after firing, and used deception to protect valuable batteries. The problem is that innovation only goes so far. Ukraine is facing a global shortage of the most advanced missile defense systems, and Kyiv is using the NATO summit to push for more supplies, faster production, and eventually the ability to manufacture more of these capabilities itself. That connects to another important shift. Ukraine is becoming a security exporter. Over the last several months, Kyiv has signed defense cooperation agreements with countries in Europe and the Middle East focused on drone warfare and air defense. The important piece is that these agreements are not simply about selling hardware. Ukraine is sharing the broader ecosystem, radar integration, command systems, training, and operational lessons learned from fighting one of the largest drone campaigns in modern history. For countries worried about future drone threats, Ukraine has become the place with the most practical experience. Russia is also continuing to test NATO directly. A Russian maritime patrol aircraft recently approached the British carrier strike group centered around HMS Prince of Wales in the Norwegian Sea. British F-35 aircraft intercepted and escorted the aircraft away after what London described as unsafe behavior. The incident fits into a broader pattern of Russian activity around NATO's borders. Aggressive reconnaissance, close encounters, and efforts to test how quickly the alliance responds. These actions are designed to create uncertainty without triggering a direct confrontation. Belarus remains another pressure point. President Alexander Lukashenko continues trying to balance his dependence on Moscow with a desire to avoid becoming more deeply involved in the war. Ukraine has pressured Belarus over Russian military infrastructure on its territory, while Lukashenko has publicly insisted Belarus will not send troops into Ukraine. The challenge for Minsk is that geography makes Belarus strategically important, whether Lukashenko wants that role or not. Russia can use Belarus for logistics, pressure against northern Ukraine, and broader signaling toward NATO's eastern flank. Finally, there is a growing diplomatic question around China. European countries are increasingly looking at Beijing's relationship with Moscow as a potential lever. Norway recently urged China to use its access to Russian leadership to help move toward negotiations. Beijing has avoided directly taking responsibility for ending the war while maintaining close ties with Russia. That balancing act is becoming more difficult as Europe increasingly views the Russia problem and the China problem as connected parts of the same strategic challenge. Thanks for listening. If this was useful, a quick review or comment helps others find the show. For deeper coverage, check out our daily intel brief on Substack at restrictedhandling.substack.com. Have a great day.